Snow drifted softly over the barbed wire. Beyond it, silence. Only the creak of boots on frozen dirt and the faint hum of a diesel generator broke the calm. It was December 1945, deep in Wisconsin, inside a U.S. prisoner of war camp that held an unlikely population, German women. Most of them weren't frontline soldiers. They were clerks, nurses, or communication officers of the Third Reich, evacuated from collapsing bases in France and Austria before capture. Some still wore their service coats, faded gray wool trimmed with red piping, as if clinging to a vanished empire. That afternoon, they were called to the mess hall. The Americans had prepared lunch. Steam fogged the windows, carrying a strange, sweet scent through the cold air. Something buttery, unfamiliar, and warm. As they stepped into line, their boots clicking on the linoleum floor, whispers passed between them. Was ist das? Smells like candy. No, it's pig feed. On the metal trays ahead of them sat a golden square of bread, yellow, coarse, and glistening with melted butter. To these proud women, raised on rationed rye and propaganda, it looked absurd, a peasant food. One nurse, Elfriede Hennig, reportedly smirked and muttered under her breath. So this is American luxury, sweet cake for soldiers. Others laughed quietly, too. Laughter was the only power they had left. But that laughter would not last long. When the first bite came, the hall went silent. It wasn't just bread. It was soft, warm, faintly sweet, and impossibly fresh. A food without bitterness, without the taste of war. Elfriede froze mid-chew, her eyes blinking. It was nothing like the dark, hard loaves from home. It melted like sunlight. That night, she wrote in her confiscated diary, one line that would later be found by historians. I tasted America today. It was soft, golden, forgiving. She had laughed in mockery that morning. By nightfall, she couldn't stop thinking about that strange loaf and the people who made it. What began as ridicule became revelation. Because hidden in that moment, that single, absurd bite, lay one of the quietest psychological victories of World War II. The day compassion broke ideology. Every war has its weapons. Some are made of steel. Others are made of choices. While Europe starved and cities turned to rubble, the United States did something no one expected. It fed its enemies. Not just to keep them alive, but to prove a point. That democracy could win not only with firepower, but with decency. These women had been raised to believe Americans were monsters, materialistic, soulless, weak. They were told capture meant humiliation or torture. Instead, they were given coffee, blankets, soap, and warm cornbread. For the first time in years, they weren't being ordered. They were being fed. And in that small act of mercy, something began to shift, quietly, invisibly, inside the minds of people who'd been taught to hate. It didn't happen on a battlefield. It didn't make headlines. But it changed hearts and history one bite at a time. This is the forgotten story of the German women POWs who laughed at American food and found redemption in its taste. In the next few minutes, you'll see why U.S. prison camps became one of the strangest theaters of the war, a place where the victors used kindness as strategy, and where a simple recipe became an unlikely symbol of victory. Because sometimes, the strongest message isn't carved into stone. It's baked in a pan. They arrived in silence. Gray trains, windows blacked out, pulling into the frozen heart of Wisconsin. The war was over, but for these women, radio clerks, secretaries, medics of a vanished Reich, it didn't feel like peace. They had been told that capture meant degradation, that the Americans were crude victors who would make them pay for every bomb, every dead son. The camp was surrounded by pines dusted in snow. Barbed wire glistened like frost. But as they stepped through the gates, what they saw made them hesitate. Wooden barracks with stoves burning inside, laundry lines, even a Christmas tree in the mess hall. No one shouted. No rifles were raised. A sergeant simply said, "This way, ladies," and pointed them toward warm quarters. For women who had been taught that mercy was weakness, this calm felt like a trick. The first night, many refused to eat. They whispered to each other that the food might be poisoned. They spoke of Hitler's speeches, of how the Americans were soft, obsessed with comfort. "They will make us dependent," one woman said bitterly. Then they will laugh. But hunger is the enemy of pride. After 3 days they could smell the kitchen, roast meat, coffee, bread. The aroma made their stomachs ache. Slowly, one by one, they accepted trays from the American cooks. The guards didn't gloat. They didn't mock. They just nodded, as if saying, "You're safe here, even if you don't believe it yet." Each bite chipped away at fear. The eggs were fluffy, the butter rich, the coffee dark and clean. These weren't the rations of conquerors rubbing victory in their captives' faces. They were meals meant to restore strength. And that confused them more than cruelty ever could. One of the nurses, Erica, wrote home in a letter later confiscated by censors. "They give us food fit for officers. I think of Mother, who stands in line for bread. What kind of enemy is this?" She wasn't alone in that thought. Across the barracks, the same unease spread. They had seen the Reich collapse under starvation. Here, the enemy fed them as if to prove something. But what? Was it charity? Or was it control? At night, they huddled under U.S. Army blankets and argued in whispers. "They want us to believe in them," one insisted. "They are trying to wash our minds." Another shook her head. "No, they're showing us what they believe in." Kindness had become the new front line. Each sunrise brought more contradictions. Guards joked softly with each other, never raised voices, and sometimes shared cigarettes through the wire. An American officer even taught one woman how to say, "Good morning," in English. She tried to hide her smile when she repeated it back. This was not the war they had prepared for. When the next meal came, hot stew, potatoes, fruit, they no longer hesitated. But among the familiar dishes sat something new, something bright yellow and strange. It looked almost like cake, glistening with butter. Some of the women laughed quietly. "More of their tricks," said Erica. That loaf, still steaming, would soon do more to dismantle pride than any speech or bullet ever could. The mornings in the camp began with the sound of a bell and the smell of food. By the second week, the women knew what that bell meant: warmth, safety, and the unfamiliar comfort of being cared for by their enemies. But what none of them knew was that their treatment wasn't accidental. Every serving, every plate, every polite gesture was part of a deliberate American strategy. A kind of warfare that required no guns, no threats, only discipline and patience. Back in Washington, policymakers had debated for months how to handle German prisoners, especially women. Some officials wanted strict rations, hard labor, humiliation. But the War Department, guided by President Roosevelt's directives, insisted on something different: decency as demonstration. The United States would follow the Geneva Convention not as an obligation, but as proof of moral superiority. If Nazism had been built on cruelty and fear, America would crush it with abundance. And so, in camps from Texas to Wisconsin, the American military machine turned compassion into logistics. Prisoners received nearly the same rations as U.S. soldiers: fresh meat twice a week, fruit, vegetables, even coffee. Psychologists called it comparative morale engineering. The idea was simple: feed the enemy better than their own country could, and you dismantle their ideology from the inside. For the German women, it felt like stepping into an alternate reality. They had seen villages burned, children starving, soldiers freezing to death in retreat. Here, they watched guards waste breadcrumbs to feed birds. They saw cooks measure butter like it grew on trees. The contradictions were dizzying. One young stenographer, Gerda, sat alone at the long wooden table one evening, staring at her tray. "In Berlin," she murmured, "people kill for sugar." The woman beside her, another POW, whispered, "Then why do they give it to us?" That question hung in the air. The answer wasn't kindness, it was control through conscience. By showing mercy, the Americans created an impossible moral mirror. Every spoonful carried a silent message. Look how we treat you. How did your Reich treat others? Reports from camp psychologists show that the shift began quickly. After 2 weeks of regular meals, the hostility in interviews dropped by nearly half. The same women who spat the word Americaner in disgust began saying, "They are strange people, not monsters." Guards noticed, too. The laughter that once carried defiance softened into genuine amusement. They caught some prisoners humming jazz tunes the radio played from the recreation hall. One guard, a farm boy from Illinois, brought an apple pie to the barracks one night, saying, "For Christmas." No one refused a slice. But the real test came when the cooks introduced a dish no German had ever seen before. A thick, yellow square made from ground maize, baked until golden, served warm with butter and honey. The Americans called it cornbread. The Germans called it ridiculous. "Animal feed," muttered one woman. Another whispered, "They fatten us for shame." The guards heard the laughter, but didn't respond. They knew what would happen next. As the trays moved down the line, steam curling off the golden loaves, curiosity began to replace pride. One by one, they took a bite, and that's when the first crack appeared. It was warm, soft, sweet. The butter melted across the surface, mixing with the sugar, turning grain into silk. No bitterness, no sourness, just comfort. Some chewed slowly, eyes down, unwilling to admit what they were feeling. Others simply stared at the slice, as if wondering what kind of people would give something this good to their prisoners. In that moment, no one spoke. The mess hall went still. Later, one woman, the same who had mocked it, would write, "They gave us bread made from the earth, not from hatred. It was the taste of a country that knew no hunger." The Americans had proven their point without saying a word. Every spoonful, every crumb of that cornbread was a quiet declaration that democracy had something the Reich could never manufacture: humanity. And deep inside, the women began to feel the weight of that difference. The day cornbread was first served in the Wisconsin camp would be remembered long after the snow melted. It arrived unannounced, steaming on metal trays, carried by American cooks who didn't speak German but smiled anyway. To them, it was just lunch, comfort food from home. To the women behind the barbed wire, it was something else entirely. A test of pride. They had heard of cornmeal before. Back in Germany, maize was for livestock. Only the poorest farmers touched it. The idea that a modern nation would bake it into bread and serve it proudly was laughable. As they lined up, the women smirked, trading whispers that echoed off the wooden walls. "Pig feed," one said. "Peasant cake," another replied, and laughter rippled through the line. But when the first bite came, the laughter died instantly. It wasn't dry or bitter. It was soft, rich, faintly sweet, like sunlight turned into food. The butter melted across their fingers. The warmth hit their throats like a promise they didn't understand. They didn't want to like it, but the body doesn't ask permission. Hunger decides faster than pride. Silence spread down the tables. Spoons clinked. Someone muttered, "It's good." That single word broke something invisible in the air. Heads turned, eyes flicked toward guards who pretended not to notice. The same women who had mocked the bread a minute ago now tore small pieces from it slowly, carefully, as though afraid to lose a single crumb. Later that night, the guards found one of the women, Gerda, the quiet radio operator, sitting on her bunk holding a napkin. Inside it was a corner of the cornbread. She wasn't hoarding it for hunger. She was saving it. When asked why, she said softly, "To remember the taste." In her confiscated diary, she wrote, "It is strange to feel warmth in captivity. I do not know what to think anymore." That confusion, that fracture between ideology and reality, was exactly what the Americans wanted. The cornbread was no accident. Camp commanders had been instructed to serve familiar foods with a twist: peanut butter, sweet tea, cornbread, all symbols of American abundance. To eat them was to experience, even briefly, what democracy felt like: plenty without cruelty. Soon, the change became visible. The women who once saluted the Reichsflag before bed now traded smiles with the cooks. The smell of cornbread became the scent of peace. When it baked, guards said the barracks grew quieter, the tension lighter, as if the aroma itself carried a message. Letters smuggled home spoke of it. One woman wrote to her sister in Dresden, "They feed us like guests. They make even the poor grain taste like gold." The censor underlined that line in red but let it pass. Perhaps even he understood that this, too, was part of victory. By the third week, requests began to appear, shy, awkward, written in broken English. Can we have the yellow bread again? More corn cake. Please recipe. One guard, amused, slipped them a copy of a military cookbook, the page for Southern cornbread folded neatly. The next morning, the prisoners tried to bake it themselves in the kitchen tent. The first batch burned. The second collapsed. The third came out perfect. When the guards tasted it, they said nothing, just nodded. The German women smiled back for the first time. What began as a moment of humiliation had become communion. And somewhere between the laughter and the last crumb, ideology began to crumble too. If the enemy could make something this gentle, this generous, what else had they been wrong about? The taste of cornbread had become something more dangerous than any weapon. The taste of doubt. By February 1946, the women no longer marched to meals. They walked freely between barracks and kitchen, a quiet rhythm replacing the tension that once hung over the camp. The same barbed wire that once symbolized defeat now stood almost ornamental. Something inside it had changed, not through orders or propaganda, but through repetition, warmth, and food. The guards had noticed it first. Their daily reports no longer mentioned discipline problems or refusal to work. Instead, they spoke of volunteers, German women asking to help in the kitchens, sewing rooms, and infirmaries. The most surprising request came from Erica, one of the most defiant prisoners. She asked to learn baking. The same woman who once mocked cornbread now stood side by side with an American sergeant, measuring sugar with precision. At first, she said it was to understand the enemy. But when the first tray came out of the oven, golden, steaming, identical to the one that had silenced the camp weeks earlier, she didn't hand it off. She tore a piece, held it up to her nose, and whispered, "This smell, it feels like forgiveness." There were no grand speeches, no ceremonies, just the quiet spread of understanding through something as simple as sharing a meal. Red Cross visitors wrote astonished notes in their reports. Morale exceptional, prisoners cooperative, even cheerful. Relations between guards and inmates human. They struggled to describe it in official terms. What they were seeing wasn't just order. It was transformation. The U.S. Army psychologists who visited the camp called it culinary disarmament. No leaflets.
No lecturas.
Just decency served 3 times a day until it became undeniable. Meanwhile, the prisoners' letters home began changing tone. What began as complaints about humiliation turned into observations. Cautious at first, then almost admiring. They are disciplined without cruelty. They laugh too much, but it is not mockery. They feed us as they feed their own. Each letter that slipped through the censors became a tiny crack in the myth of Nazi superiority back home. Word spread among civilians who still believed the Reich's propaganda. The Americans are not beasts, one villager told an interviewer years later. My niece wrote that they even baked for them. Inside the camp, that realization took hold. The women began to teach the guards German words. In exchange, they learned American slang. Coffee break, sweet tooth, home. When the winter thaw came, something remarkable happened. The women organized a thank you meal. Using leftover rations, they baked cornbread themselves. A little burnt, uneven, but unmistakable. On top of each loaf, they pressed the shape of their camp number with a spoon. When they served it, no one laughed. The American cooks didn't make speeches. They just stood in line, took a piece, nodded and said, "Good work." It was a small thing, a trade of gestures across the lines that had once divided conqueror and captive. But in that room, the last walls came down. Historians would later call it the human victory, a moment when the principles behind democracy, dignity, equality, patience, stopped being slogans and became lived reality. The war had been won years before, but the peace was being won here, in a wooden hall in Wisconsin, where enemies baked together. As the sun set over the pine trees, one of the guards watched the women cleaning up and said quietly, "We didn't break them. We just let them see who we are." And for the first time, that truth felt heavier than any weapon he had ever held. Spring came slowly that year. The snow melted into the black soil of Wisconsin, and with it, the last traces of captivity began to fade. The German women no longer lined up in silence for roll call. They chatted softly with guards, shared cigarettes, even exchanged recipes scribbled on scrap paper. The barbed wire still stood, but it no longer meant fear, it meant memory. By April, rumors spread. Repatriation. The war was long over. Ships would soon take them home. Yet home was no longer what it had been. Letters from Germany described ruins. Cities reduced to dust, hunger everywhere, families scattered. The Reich they had once served with blind faith had vanished. What waited for them now was uncertainty. In those last weeks, the camp kitchen became the heart of everything. The ovens burned non-stop, filling the air with that now familiar scent of butter and cornmeal. For the women, cornbread had become more than food. It was a ritual, a symbol of calm in a collapsing world. They baked it for every farewell meal, every goodbye. Elfriede, the nurse who had once sneered at it, took over the mixing. She measured each scoop of cornmeal with reverence, humming softly. The guards joked that she'd become the German Betty Crocker. She laughed. Not the sharp, defensive laughter of months before, but real laughter, soft and human. On their final morning, they gathered in the mess hall one last time. American and German flags hung side by side, faded cloths in a drafty room. Every table was lined with trays of warm cornbread. The guards stood among them, not above them. No commands, no ranks, just people. When the women sat, no one needed to be told what to do. They ate in silence, letting the warmth fill the space between them. Outside, trucks waited to take them to the port. The sound of engines rumbled faintly, a reminder that this peace was temporary. One woman, Gerda, the radio operator who had saved her first peace weeks earlier, took out a small paper bundle from her coat pocket. Inside was that hardened scrap of bread. She held it up to the light. "I'm keeping this," she said softly to a nearby guard. "Not because I'm hungry, because it reminds me what forgiveness tastes like." The guard didn't answer. He just nodded. Some things didn't need words. As the last group boarded the trucks, one of the sergeants handed them a tin box wrapped in cloth. "From the cooks," he said. Inside were loaves of cornbread. Their laughter was quiet this time, touched with disbelief, touched with gratitude. On the long journey across the Atlantic, the women shared it in small pieces, passing crumbs from hand to hand. Sailors who saw them described an odd silence among the group. Not shame, not joy, but something in between. When they reached Germany, they stepped into devastation. Bombed-out cities, hollowed streets, children begging for food. In that chaos, a few of the women gathered the strength to bake again. They scavenged what they could, cornmeal from aid shipments, butter from black markets, and recreated that same loaf. For them, it was more than nostalgia. It was proof that compassion could survive even after hatred had burned everything else away. Decades later, historians found their diaries. The words were simple, but powerful. "We laughed when they served us the yellow bread. We thought we were above them. But it was we who had forgotten what humanity tastes like." The story never made it into official war histories. There were no medals, no ceremonies, no parades. Just a quiet victory, one that could not be measured in battles won, but in beliefs lost. Because in the end, America hadn't just defeated an army. It had defeated an idea, not through bullets but through bread. And sometimes, that's the most devastating weapon of all. Years passed. The camp buildings were torn down, the fences sold for scrap, the barracks reclaimed by grass. Nothing remains now but a plaque, half buried under snow each winter, marking the place where enemies once shared bread. Yet stories have a way of surviving where monuments fail. Decades later, a schoolteacher in Munich uncovered a handwritten recipe folded inside an old hymn book. It was labeled in faded English, "Cornbread, Wisconsin, 1946. Beneath it, in shaky German script, someone had written, "Never forget, warmth wins." No one knows which prisoner wrote it. Some say it was Gerda, others believe it was Elfriede. It doesn't matter. The handwriting itself was a bridge, German letters spelling American forgiveness. Food historians now study those POW camp menus as examples of soft power. Psychologists call it the moment ideology met empathy and lost. But if you ask the locals who live near that field in Wisconsin, they'll tell you something simpler. That's where the war finally ended, because wars don't always finish when the guns fall silent. Sometimes they end when the hate runs out of appetite. So if you ever smell cornbread baking, that sweet mix of butter and warmth drifting through the air, remember this. It once stopped a war from continuing inside people's hearts. They came as captives, but left as witnesses. If the story opened your eyes, the next one will keep them wide. When an American cook turned flour and deception into a weapon that starved the Nazi war machine from the inside. Subscribe and step into history's quietest victories, where kindness wins the final battle.